Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Ensemble Network webcast. Thank you to all our listeners who are tuned in today. My name is Lindsay Kajura, Manager of Diversity Initiatives for the Mining Industry Human Resource Council, and joining me today is a special guest speaker, Beth Clark. As many of you may know, MIR established its mandate to identify opportunity and ultimately address the HR and labor market challenges in the Canadian minerals and metals sector. The Canadian mining industry faces a significant challenge in establishing a sustainable supply of labor that is able to withstand mining's economic volatility. MIR, through its labor market intelligence, has identified a number of factors exacerbating this challenge. Canada's aging population continues to have a significant impact, and diverse groups such as women and newcomers to Canada are underrepresented in the mining labor force. Our research indicates that women comprise half of Canada's population and about 48% of its labor force. Yet in the mining labor force, women represent only 17%. Improving this statistic involves a combination of collaborative solutions, from encouraging young girls to pursue math and science studies, to building a gender-inclusive awareness of the industry, to appointing more women to senior leadership and board positions. During this webinar, Beth Clark will provide an overview of tools and resources that can support employers in understanding the education and experience immigrants bring with them, as well as practical advice to help attract and retain immigrant talent. So with that said, I'll pass it over to you, Beth.
Thank you, Lindsay. And I'd like to thank MIR for inviting me to participate in this webinar today. And thank you, all of you who are listening, for giving up your lunchtime to join us today. Some of you may not have heard of World Education Services, or WES as we often call ourselves, and I'll tell you more about the organization and how we can help in understanding international credentials in a few minutes. But first, I'd like to start by setting some context for our work and why today's webinar topic is so important for HR leaders and managers in light of the in light of the trends that will shape the labor market as we move into this next decade. I expect what I'm about to say is probably not new information for most of you, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of the realities that we're facing now or that we will be facing in the next few years. And it certainly provides some context for our work at WES and for this presentation. So if we look at our current labor market, at the end of 2019, Canada's unemployment rate was sitting at 5.5%. And in Canada, this is seen as pretty close to full employment. So I probably don't need to tell you that it's getting harder to fill vacancies. And specifically, depending where you are in Canada, that becomes especially true. In fact, 39% of small and medium-sized businesses now are facing talent shortages, and that's likely to persist for at least a decade, according to a BDC study on worker scarcity. So some of what's impacting us, and as we look ahead, we know that automation is going to drive demand for STEM workers and further skill shortages in those areas. And technology will change the way that we do our jobs. So augmentation is going to require new skill sets to do the work that we're doing today. I think we can probably all think of examples of where we've seen how our individual work has already started changing. And essentially, technology and automation go hand in hand in changing the nature of the work and how we work. And so no doubt you're already feeling the effects of automation on the labor market as augmentation changes how we work. It's expected now that 42% of Canadian jobs are going to be disrupted by automation in the next 10 to 20 years. And that doesn't imply that 42% of jobs are going to be entirely lost, but rather it means that we can expect a significant overhaul of the skills that are going to be required for most jobs. And it will shift the skills profile for certain sectors and professions as these jobs are impacted by automation. And ultimately, the rate of change from technological advancements makes it challenging to predict not only the jobs of the future, but the skills that are going to be needed in the future. And if you consider that 9% of new jobs that will be created by 2030 don't even exist today, that just becomes even more challenging. But where there does seem to be consensus is that the demand for digitally skilled people is going to continue to increase. And the Future of Jobs report from the World Economic Forum indicates that some key sectors where they're expecting to see new jobs, of course, are in cybersecurity, architecture and engineering, and computer science. This will then have spillover into installation, renewable energy, but even in areas like HR, they're expecting within areas such as career transitions advisors and professional development specialists as being areas that are going to start seeing tremendous growth as we navigate some of this change. And so I think that probably, I'm imagining, may hit home and within the mining sector as well. Um, but in addition to the changes resulting from technology, the labor market is also going through dramatic shifts globally as well as in Canada as a result of aging demographics. And in Canada, that is especially true. The population is getting older, and many folks are planning to retire in the next 10 and 20 years. So this leaves us with quite a looming labor market shortage. And there's a huge opportunity in Canada, and as well as an obligation to ensure that we're leveraging the skills of highly skilled immigrants in order to be competitive. And in response, or sorry, Canada, looking at the next slide, Canada has a world-renowned immigration system. We're recognized for our ability to attract and integrate immigrant talent, and it's really at the heart of how we're going to be able to solve the talent shortage problem in the future. A recent Conference Board of Canada study found that when they were looking at predictions and labor force growth in years to come, that if they considered full labor market participation from underrepresented groups, so if they looked at full participation of women in the workforce, youth, Aboriginal, people with disabilities, that Canada still wouldn't be able to keep up with our projected labor force needs without relying on immigration to fill the gaps. So 90% of our labor force growth is expected to come from immigration in the next little while, and it's ultimately going to make up the majority of our population growth as well. In fact, by 2034, immigration is expected to account for 100% of our population growth in Canada. And so in response to that, in response to the looming population and labor market, the looming population shortage and labor market shortage, the Canadian government sets immigration levels to ensure that we have the workforce needed to meet future demands. And more than 1 million immigrants will be arriving in Canada between 2019 and 2021, according to the current federal targets that have been set. And you see the targets on your screen. By 2021, Canada will be bringing in close to 1% of the Canadian population through immigration each year. And that's not exactly the mass migration that you heard about during the election, but it's significant in terms of meeting our labor force demands. And what some people may not know is that within these levels, the government sets out a mix of immigrants that are coming in through various immigration streams. So what you see in the graph on your screen is that 60% of the new immigrants to Canada, or almost 60%, are going to be coming in through economic streams. And when we look at these specific streams, we know that more than 50% of those who are coming through economic streams hold a bachelor's degree or higher. We're attracting a very highly skilled workforce in Canada, and that is a real opportunity for the country and for how we're going to address this shortage in years to come. So, and this is where WES comes in. World Education Services is a social enterprise that operates in Canada and the United States. And we've been evaluating international academic credentials and advocating for the recognition since 1974, so almost 46 years in the US. And we're going to be celebrating our 20th year in Canada this year. And I think it's also important to recognize that their organization does more than evaluating credentials. We also provide skilled immigrants with information and resources so that they can make good decisions to guide their journey. We work to enable systems and influence policy so that they can be successful in applying their education and skills. And we innovate to improve accessibility to the labor market. And one of the things that we do, or part of my team's work, is conducting research to inform our work. And recently we released a paper where we looked at the employment outcomes of 6,400 immigrants to Canada who had their credentials assessed by WES between 2013 and 2015, and who were actually in the country by 2018. And the good news when we looked at that was 80% of those we surveyed were employed. However, only 50% of those were working in the same field or were working at a similar level to what they were doing before they came. Just short of 40% had jobs with duties similar in complexity to the jobs that they had before coming to Canada. And I bring this up because there's clearly we have a ways to go in recognizing the knowledge and experience that immigrants bring. When you look at the labor gaps that we're going to see in years to come, we need to do a better job of being able to recognize the skills and experience that these individuals are bringing into the country if we know that we're going to need them and that this is an opportunity that we need to be able to seize. RBC has done studies and estimates that Canada forgoes $50 billion in GDP in wage gap due to underemployment of immigrants. So that's really significant. And I will say that at West we recognize that education is a first step, but it's really only one piece of the puzzle. I think as overall we need to do a better job at making sure that hiring managers are able to understand what credential evaluation is and how it can be helpful in understanding what immigrants bring to the country. Um, and so I do thank you for joining this webinar today, and I will welcome you if you are listening. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or to us at West if you'd like to discuss how we can make credential evaluation more valuable to you. Um, so I did mention that evaluation of international credentials as a starting point towards recognition or for finding long-term suitable employment, because it does provide a translation or a proof of one's qualifications in a way that can be easily understood. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about what is credential evaluation. And in the case of WES, our assessments speak to the authenticity of academic documents and the educational attainment. The credential evaluation provides a reliable comparison of the academic qualifications that have been obtained abroad to their equivalent qualifications in Canada, in the US or Canada, I should say. But I'll focus here today on our Canadian work. Simply said, the credential evaluation report is a report that gives employers a description of the internationally educated professionals' educational background in familiar terms that you would understand. And in the case of Wes, our assessments provide verified proof of the claimed education by insisting that our documents are submitted for assessment come to us directly from the granting institutions overseas. So this is we do hear often people talk about how hard it can be to get a WES assessment and the challenges that individuals have to go through to be able to get this assessment. However, what that does is it allows those who are receiving the reports to know that the validity and that the document has been verified and that it is authentic. And these assessments provide a springboard for suitable employment, for further education, and for licensing in regulated occupations. Um, and I should note that evaluating and verifying the credential is again one part. We continue to work to make sure that these credentials are trusted and that ultimately they're recognized by working with regulatory bodies and with higher education institutions and with employers as well to make sure that they are understood and that that people understand how to use these documents. There are really three phases or processes that are involved in credential evaluation, and just at a high level, ultimately we assess the claimed credential based on the documentation that we've received, the documentation of the credential that we see, the qualifications. We recognize based on the equivalency in the local market and determine what the local equivalency is, and we validate that the credential is and is what it's claimed to be, and giving our professional opinion so that institutions can then further assess for their own particular needs. And that's specifically important when we get into the licensing and licensed professions. Okay, so essentially a credential evaluation provides a reliable comparison of an academic qualification that's been obtained abroad to their equivalent qualification in US and Canada. The credential evaluation reports helps institutions like employers and licensing boards, immigration authorities to better understand a candidate's educational background. And if you are wondering about how you can trust that we know what we're doing, I did mention we've been doing this work for quite some time. To date, WES has issued more than 2 million credential evaluations in Canada and the US. And there's 2,500 educational, business, and governmental institutions that recognize WES. So we're widely known in the academic credential evaluation space as being a leader in this field. And over the years, we've built a robust database that contains information on more than 220 countries and jurisdictions. So our database of educational qualifications is large. We're working with 48,000 educational institutions. We have records on 22,000 credentials and equivalencies. And, oh, my note is missing. And ultimately, a lot of data that backs up the information that we have available to us. Um, yeah, 4,300 grading scales. And so the research and policy team that we have here at WES is continuously tracking and monitoring developments in the education space, both in Canada and around the world. And that continuously informs our policy as well as we do our work. And so we see a lot of volume. In 2018, West Canada provided credential evaluation reports to 318,000 individuals in Canada. So these numbers that you see in the circles on your screen would showcase sort of the work that's being done at West on the whole. But 318,000 was our total in 2018. We're right now pulling together our reports on last year, and I expect we'll see a larger number yet come out of 2019. Um, and you'll see sort of how our volume has grown in recent years. We're really the leading credential evaluation, and so organizing, working to, and trying to work to help institutions like employers and schools and licensing boards better understand the credentialing backgrounds that individuals are bringing. And now, I'm wondering if any of you have seen this document before. The reason that I mentioned our volume just now in 20 and looking at sort of the difference and sort of where we've come from 2013, where we were in the smaller circles on the slide you just saw, to the largest outer circle being at 4,000, or sort of 413,000, but in Canada, 318,000. I'll just bring that back up. If you look at those screens in the initial early stages, we were quite a bit smaller and have had quite a bit of growth in recent years. I mentioned that because in 2013, when you saw the volume really leap up, the government introduced a new immigration requirement that principal applicants coming to Canada under the economic stream had to have their credentials assessed. The government wanted to make sure that we had a very skilled workforce coming into the country. And what this means for you as an employer is that many of the job seekers that you may see coming to your offices may have actually already had their credentials assessed as part of their immigration process, and may very well know what their equivalency is by Canadian standards. So on your screen, I've actually included an example of the educational credential assessment, or we call it an ECA, at WES. This is the document that's used for immigration purposes. And this, can be used as well to verify a candidate's qualifications. So if they've come in and have used WES as part of their immigration process, they would already have this. And it has the equivalency statement right on the form. We do have other products though as well. We also have more robust document by document versions of our report and course by course evaluations as well for those who want to see the finer granularity of the courses of study. And applicants can upgrade from their basic report online at WES from the ECA that was used for immigration to a document by document version for $50. So it's not expensive. And the standard processing time for this credential evaluation would be 7 days following the receipt and review and approval of all their documents. So it's a very simple process that individuals can go through, and really so many have already started this process or maybe in the middle of the process when you're speaking with them. So I wanted to show you what that looks like in case you may see people coming through or may want to ask if people have gone through that process. Next, though, what I expect you may have been more likely to see is this equivalency statement that's on your screen, evaluated by World Education Services as equivalent to a 4-year Canadian bachelor's degree. Oftentimes, the way you'll know if a job applicant has had their credentials assessed is that you may see candidates adding a statement to their resume indicating that they have had it assessed. There are other credential evaluation organizations in Canada, although I will say that we do about 90% of the business, so we're probably the one you're more likely to be seeing. And this is how most immigrants are going to inform an employer that they've had their credentials already evaluated. Or they may tell you in an interview and bring that up as they're talking through. Many of the immigrant serving organizations across Canada are familiar with our work as well and would be advocating for immigrants to be informing it through their job search process when they have gone through a credential evaluation service. Okay. Now, there is another way that you may start seeing as well, and you may be able to know if credentials have been assessed. And this is our new West Digital Badge. So in late 2018, we started issuing digital badges hosted on the Credential platform. And to date, we've issued 75,000 badges in Canada, another 15,000 in the US. And we expect that that number, while it's small now, it is going to continue to grow as we roll out our digital badges for people. So the digital badge can be shared on LinkedIn. So you may start seeing it on LinkedIn, on online resumes, on if individuals have built web pages or have Twitter that they're using in their job search, that's where you may see people applying their digital badge. And if you're not familiar with electronic badges and you're wondering what does it mean, it's essentially an electronic credential. And in our case, in the case of Wes, when you see somebody that has that digital badge, it means that Wes has verified the authenticity of the claimed credential. It means that WES has verified the awarding institution and the program was recognized when the credential was issued. It means that we have assessed the associated credential for the Canadian or American equivalency and that we've issued a completed report to the recipient that has that. And this is what the digital badge looks like if you are seeing it on a LinkedIn profile, for example. Um, the top 3 statements that you see on that badge confirms that the credential has been verified and evaluated, that the awarding institution or program was accredited, and that the equivalency has been determined. And the details of that are shown below. And I also wanted to share this tool as well that I thought could be useful for some of you. This is our degree equivalency tool, and it's available free of charge on our WES website. Um, The degree equivalency tool allows you to look up a degree and get a preview of what its equivalency could be in Canada. This was originally created to help those who are living abroad to get a sense of what their degree equivalency might be like or might what it may be in Canada to inform their decision to migrate and to get a sense of where they would be coming in. But I think this can also be valuable as a hiring manager if you're trying to get a rough sense of what a degree may be. There are limitations to this, though. Firstly, I will say that not every country or degree that's in our database is represented in this tool. This is a tool that does need to be migrated over, and so therefore, our a full evaluation will give you access to much more. Also, you would need to have the school name to be able to search, as our evaluation takes into account the standing of the institution itself. And lastly, this won't obviously tell you what an individual has. This can just look at the degree equivalency. To find out for an individual, they would have to go through that process themselves. So just want to highlight those caveats. But the last tool I wanted to share today is Access West, and I focused my time mostly talking about some of the more passive ways to help you understand the credentials that immigrants bring in. I wanted to think about it from the perspective of what might you see and what might be coming to you and landing on your desks as you're going through your work. However, if there is something that you like, if your organization needs something that's more reliable, authenticated in the sense of being able to get real-time access to reports, then Access West may be something that that may be worth exploring. Access West provides a secured online delivery of a credential evaluation. So through this gives you access to our website to be, we would have an MOU. When we do have MOUs with a number of the organizations that we work with, and through our website, they're able to get high resolution images of verified transcripts, real-time applicant status updates so that anybody using our report can get that access immediately to inform their decisions. And so, don't hesitate to reach out if this is something that you are interested in learning more about. Um, but I did start this presentation by talking about the trends that are going to shape our labor market. And I've hopefully built the case on why integrating immigrant talent is going to be so important as Canada moves forward in the next decade or two. But I also think it's important to talk for a few minutes about some of the practical ideas on how you can recognize the skills and credentials that immigrants are bringing in with them past the credential evaluation. And I think a big challenge that many employers face is that newcomers are not necessarily in the same networks as employers. Really, particularly depending on where you are in Canada, you may have less contact with immigrants and with immigrant groups, and staff within organizations may be less familiar with those who have been working and trained abroad. And so I think, where there's opportunities in your communities, participating in refugee and immigrant hiring events that are being delivered by immigrant serving organizations or refugee serving organizations, as well as partnering with newcomer communities to host networking events is a really great opportunity to bring diversity into an organization's networks. But I think those networking opportunities also create a great opportunity to build familiarity with individuals who may be different or people are not coming in contact with as regularly. I mean, we know that when people start understanding and seeing each other as colleagues and as humans, then that breaks down a lot of barriers in terms of being able to see what individuals are bringing into the country. Another opportunity is with the growing numbers of international students that Canada is seeing. Hiring international students or students with immigrant backgrounds through co-op experiences and work integrated learning opportunities also provides an organization with opportunities to develop their cross-cultural competencies and start also breaking down some of those barriers that may exist where immigrants may not have been so readily integrated in the past. And I would encourage you to reach out to immigrant employment councils, immigrant and refugee serving organizations for support in creating diverse hiring panels and looking for training on unconscious biases that may exist, for assessing applications on the basis of skills and not just Canadian experience. There is a lot of information that exists in Canada to support employers in being able to access immigrant talent. And so these organizations can be a really great support as well. And I spent a lot of time talking about automation at the start. And while some tasks and skills are being automated, I think the focus remains on and will remain on a lot of those skills that can't be automated. Looking at the soft skills and things like responsibility and creativity, imagination, and leadership will continue to be in the hands of humans. And so I think the big question that we have to look at as HR departments and workplace strategists is to look at how we can allow employees to bring those skills forward and how we can recognize those skills. It's going to be even more important to focus on competency-based hiring. So I think oftentimes we talk about when interviewing, focusing on scenarios and tell us about a time and certainly that serves a role, but that can be particularly challenging when someone has worked in a different context, and it can be put people at a disadvantage or to be able to describe that if language is not necessarily as strong. So, looking at, is there a way to demo that skill or to test a skill and building that into an interview process. And I think as well, another piece that's important is that in order to capitalize on automation, industries are going to have, of course, have to be thinking about how they can attract and retain and retrain talent. And that applies to everyone. So management strategies that focus on training and development of employees are also going to be key, not only in terms of attracting talent as competition for talent gets much more extreme, but also from diverse pools and looking at how do you look at the long-term potential of the individual supported by learning to help them grow and adapt and change through the changes that we're seeing in terms of technology and automation. And if anything, I would say one of the real assets of an immigrant group is this is a group of individuals that have already, by virtue of the fact that they've immigrated to Canada, have demonstrated that they have great skills in coping and adapting to change. And so that's something that we need to look at. How do we take advantage of? And I think really if we handle sort of the transformation that we're going through sensitively, when we look at sort of that shift from man to machine, we can look at opportunities and many industries can be much more attractive to some of this new pools of talent and new job opportunities. So I guess couple of the things I wanted to talk about on this slide, just some things that you may want to consider as an employer. Um, it's important to recognize that workplace integration is a two-way street, and I'm sure many of you working in HR, this is not new, but I think it always is worth reminding again that new immigrant employees will need to adapt to your workplace and your culture, but also your recruitment and onboarding processes also may need to adapt to be inclusive for newcomers. And so things that you may want to consider, you may want to be asking yourself, does my recruitment process create barriers for immigrants where English is a second language? So for example, often phone interviews can create challenges because candidates cannot readily read body language to help out where there could be gaps in understanding. Facial expressions and gestures that can be helpful are missed when you're on the phone, and they can often misinterpret slang or a technical question over the phone. So if you're conducting phone interviews as an initial screening process, it's important to take language proficiency into consideration before screening out that candidate. Also consider the questions that you're asking during interview. So for some cultures, individuals may be discouraged from boasting or celebrating their accomplishments, and therefore in an interview, the candidate may downplay or not necessarily um, bring forth their specific contributions. So you may need to ask probing questions to get at the actual skills that they were using in their work. And as I mentioned before, for more technical based questions, it's important to provide candidates with an opportunity to showcase those skills and look at are there opportunities to demonstrate that. Okay. And the last piece here that I wanted to mention is I think to look at to look at what are your actual needs in the role versus your wants in the role. Um, you know, if you're looking at a position where most of the work is technical, um, do you really need to? So, for example, if it's a technical role that requires 80% of the time working independently, um, do you really want to exclude a candidate due to perhaps weaker language proficiency or social qualities or like perceived friendliness if it doesn't really align with the requirements for the role? The language proficiency we know is dramatically improved when the newcomer is immersed in a workplace, as is understanding of Canadian workplace culture. So similar to a first date in an interview, it's really an opportunity to assess that potential, right? And look at how can you then maybe leverage internships or other opportunities to then be able to realize those skills and benefits without experiencing the long-term risk. So there's ways around that. And again, we'll be also having here at Wes more practical tips. We're going to be having an upcoming webinar as well on recruitment trends and adopting new strategies to prepare immigrant talent. So do feel free to follow up and we can share that information or sign up on our website. So moving forward, The discussion regarding competency-based hiring is a conversation about talents that are being impacted, not just highly skilled immigrants. Like this is really a conversation that extends to all talent who will be facing the same kinds of challenges. So one of the things I do want to recognize is that you may be saying, okay, well, this has been, we have focused here largely on the academic credentials, and that is part. And how do you know how a person has the skills to do the job? And I hopefully I've addressed some of that in the conversation around hiring practices and whatnot. Um, but we also understand this challenge at Wes, and we would argue that it's not necessarily just skills at the exclusion of the degree. We feel that this really does go hand in hand. And my team has also been looking into this specifically. So we've issued a paper recently called Beyond Academic Credentials Towards Competency Informed Hiring, where we're looking at what does this mean specifically for a newcomer audience. And we're expanding a mapping of a national and international best practices in competency assessment and competency informed hiring. And we'll be convening a roundtable on competency informed assessment and testing, some promising tools that we've started testing in the fall, and we're currently in the process of testing some more tools that we think will be really beneficial to support employers in being able to also draw out what are those specific skills that immigrants have. So in closing, I think the fact that you've joined today really tells me that you know that we need to do things differently and that you think that we can do a better job. Um, we need to we need your help to build solutions that are going to work for you, for the employer, because I think ultimately this is where the buck stops. So I would invite you to connect with me, connect with me here, and engage with us in building solutions that make sense. Please reach out if you'd like to learn more about our work on competency assessment and hiring, and if we are able to support your company in any way on this. So thank you for your presentation, and I know we've got time for questions.
All right, so just a reminder to our listeners, you do have a chat box where you can type in any questions that we'll be able to ask to Beth. And so we'll get started with the question and answer period. So thank you so much, Beth, for all of that wonderful information and explaining really how the credential evaluation process works at Wes.
You're welcome.
So the first question here, can employers request a credential evaluation on behalf of an applicant? And if so, what percentage of credential evaluations are job seeker initiated versus employer initiated?
That's a good question. So two parts. I think the first part of that question was, can an employer request it on behalf of an applicant? And the answer is no. So if I understand the question, the employer wouldn't be able to contact Wes and say, "Can I see the academic credential evaluation for John Doe?" That would be a privacy concern. However, the employer can ask John Doe if he has had a credential evaluation done, and if so, would they be willing to provide it to the employer? Now, having said that, I did mention Access West. So if, for example, an employer asked, the candidate, have you had that done? Perhaps they have or hadn't. If that employer was registered as Access West, then when that candidate, the applicant sent us all their information, we performed the credential evaluation, the MOUs signed and agreements and privacy sign-offs that we would have at that stage would allow us to then transmit the document to the employer directly. But we would need the job applicant's permission to do that. There was a second part to that question, I think, as well. Can you remind me the second piece to that, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think, well, the second part was only really relevant if the answer was yes, because
Okay.
the second part was what percentage of credential evaluations are job seeker initiated versus employer initiated.
Yes, so they would all be, yes, so that's correct. They would have all been initiated by the job seeker. I mean, for example, TTC in Toronto requires can't anybody coming into employment with education from overseas, they require the individual applicant to have their credentials evaluated by Wes. In that case, the applicant would submit their documentation to us. We would perform the credential evaluation and through our site transmit that information to TTC directly, but the client, the applicant, the job seeker would be telling us to do that.
Good. All right, the second question is, what types of tools and resources are there to help immigrants with their career path and development once they have already attained the job?
Oh, that's a very good question. I think there's probably some regional differences across the country because a lot of job search support is provided free to immigrants by government and through government funding. But there is a wealth of information that's out there when we're talking about general support. Um, First, I'll mention, at West we do have information through webinars and newsletters that is available to people across the country. But also within the various communities across the country, there's a lot of information that exists through employment resource centers that people can avail themselves of even when they're working. Some other programs and services people may only be eligible for when they're not working, but there's quite a range of services, whether through libraries, through employment resource centers. The immigrant employment councils that exist in almost each province across Canada have access to a wealth of information. And settlement.org, for example, is a website that compiles information nationally to support immigrants in their journey. So there's really a wealth of information that exists in Canada to support employers. I think where it can be more challenging for employers is when you're looking at on the job and you're actually looking for support in working with individuals and looking for some additional hand holding through challenges. But again, I think that's where the connections to immigrant serving organizations within your locations, within your communities can be so helpful because in many cases there is post-hire support. And in many cases, they can certainly are oftentimes are very willing and eager to work with employers to provide additional input and advice and services. And so I always think it's important to look at what's available in your communities, and that's certainly a role for, I mean, in terms of our work at West, if we can help connect to other organizations within your communities for further support, and we're always also interested to look at how we can support and what other advices and services may be needed. So certainly reach out to us, but I think taking a look at what exists in the communities is helpful. And for immigrants, there's a lot available.
All right, next question. So does the online tool reflect which educational institutions accept equivalent credentials as eligible admissions requirements for further education?
Okay, so I think that question was referring to the equivalency tool that I spoke about on our website, if I understood that correctly. And that equivalency, the tool that I talked about is really a tool where the individual, and so an employer or an individual can, yeah, this, Lona has just pulled it up on the screen, the degree equivalency tool. This is one where you would start and say, okay, I have I have a 4-year degree that I've obtained from Albert Ludwigs Universität in Germany, and I studied Germanistic, and I would put that in, and then I would see what would that be in by a Canadian a standard. And so it would come back and say, this will be likely equivalent to a 4-year Bachelor of Arts in a Canadian institution. So that's what the degree equivalency tool is used for. And as I said, developed for supporting individuals who are sort of maybe debating whether or not they want to come to Canada and trying to get an understanding of how likely are they to get through the immigration process, how many points, for example, in our immigration system may their degree be worth. And so they may want to check that out. But I think for an employer, if you're seeing that certain schools or degrees that you're sort of coming across your desk on a more regular basis, this can also be an opportunity to sort of put it in and say, oh, okay, that it probably is. And I think what you'll find many cases that many degrees are equivalent to what we're seeing in Canada. So it can be at least as an initial comfort if you haven't been working with many internationally trained professionals. This can be a good sort of first step in trying to get a sense of, oh, okay, I get a sense of what a degree may be. But again, with the limitations that ultimately it would be the formal assessment that would need to show what an individual would have. Did that answer the question, Lindsay?
I believe so.
Okay.
All right, so it looks like that's the end of the questions that have come in. So once again, I just want to thank you both so much for sharing your insight and expertise with our network. And for all of our listeners, if you have any further questions or concerns that weren't answered in today's webcast, don't hesitate to start the conversation on Ensemble or contact Mir or Wes directly. We encourage you to please stay connected. A recording of today's webinar will be available on the Ensemble site within a few days, and I invite you to review the monthly blog post as well. So this concludes our Ensemble webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day and join us for our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.